If you've been watching the videos in the Org Design Studio series, by now you've gathered a sense of how one might think about organization design bottom up, starting with the teams, the departments, the groups, the smallest units and building blocks of large complex organizations. But our conversation so far has been very much focused on the formal aspect of organization design, by which I mean things like the rules, the reporting structures, the incentives, flow of information, the task division, and task allocation, which somebody with authority might impose on the system. What about the informal organization? There are, in fact, a couple of different ways of thinking about the informal organization and how that interacts with the formal organization. And one way to make that point very clear is to acknowledge that, in fact, when we think about organization design, structuring, which is about the authority to make design decisions and create incentives and create flows of information and allocate tasks and so on, is only one of the pillars of organization design, one of the levers of organization. So structuring is important, but it's by no means the whole story. The other two elements of this picture, which are extremely important as well, are firstly sorting, which is the decisions around who enters and who exits the system. So hiring, retention, and sometimes firing. These things together make up sorting because it's a very important component of the design of an organization. And finally, there is sense making. This is the mutual understanding that develops over time between the people in the system. And we often use terms like leadership, vision, communication, culture to describe these phenomena. To give you a sense of how these three work together, I'd like you to imagine a game, a sport of any kind that you like, and ideally a team sport. So I'm reasonably familiar with cricket, so I'm going to give you an analogy from that world. So in the world of cricket, if you compare the performance of two teams, why are there differences? Why do some teams play well and some don't? And the answer is, while both are playing within the same broad framework of rules that define the sport, teams may have slightly different internal structures. They all have captains and vice captains, but they may have different people and different roles for individuals in those teams in terms of fielding or in terms of bowling or in terms of batting. And they may have different priorities and different hierarchy in the system in terms of whose decisions carry more weight. So that's one important element of difference between different teams. The second is, even if you held the structure of the team constant in terms of the roles, the individuals in the team can be very different. And this is obvious to any person who follows sport that the quality of the individual makes a big impact on the overall quality of the team. So, who is hired into the team, who is retained in the team matters a lot. So that's sorting. But even if you were to take two identical teams in terms of structure and in terms of composition, right? Imagine you could clone them. There is a difference between those teams when they first start playing together and when they have played together for a long time. That's sense making. So essentially, over a period of time, the members of the team learn to adjust to each other. They learn to form particular patterns of working together, which can be very effective. So, particular combinations of how two batsmen might run up and down while taking runs after hitting the ball far away towards the boundary. So, these are mutual adjustments, mutual understanding, shared beliefs, which emerge over time. That is sense making. And all of these three together combine to explain why one team does better or worse than another. So, in the same way, in an organization, we have to think beyond structure to also think about sorting and also think about sense making. In fact, a very simple heuristic to keep in mind is the more of the work of organizing we can do through sense making and sorting, the lesser the burden on structure. What do I mean by that? Imagine we were able to recruit through sorting a group of people who had highly aligned objectives and a very similar way of thinking about how to approach the world. Imagine further that this group was able to work together over time and improve that level of alignment in their thinking. So they could really agree on pretty much everything. Why then do we need structure? They could pretty much resolve everything on their own. So the purpose of structure is to minimize the burden of collaboration and coordination among people and to reduce the need for people to always reach agreement by conversation. That's one way of thinking about structure. Right? So structure minimizes conflict, reduces the burden of coordination by embedding it into the system. But instead, if through sorting and sense making, we could give people the skills coming into the system to already have the capacity to coordinate and collaborate with each other, then what do we need the structure? So, in this sense, structure, sorting, and sense making together are the set of levers we have to think about organizational design. Culture and networks, the two major forms of informal organization, are largely driven by sense making and sorting. They're closely associated with them. But we don't want to think about them in isolation from the organizational design aspects of the formal organization. We have to think about them together. So I'll sum up by saying when we think about organization design, structuring is often the set of levers we can most directly and immediately control. But it's just as important to think about longer term levers such as sorting, whom one is hiring and whom one is retaining, and also the sense making processes in the organization, which one can shape, for instance, through the possibility of frequent interaction among people, maybe random encounters among different parts of an organization, and of course, through the actions of leaders that convey important symbolic information.